Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Resonate. And I have got the most wonderful guest here with me this, is it morning? It's afternoon here, but it's morning over where you are, because this is a transatlantic discussion. And I'm talking to my friend Mark Jobe, who is the founder of New Life Churches in Chicago, a network of churches planted there. And he's the president of the Moody Bible Institute there in Chicago. And I first became acquainted with Mark about 10 years ago at one of the Pioneer conferences, but then visited his church to learn about restarts. Mark, hi.
Hey, Phil, always great to be with you and see you again. It has been a decade, so we've known each other for a long time.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? A lot of mutual friends as well have crossed the Atlantic that we've spent time with, which is lovely. So whoever we send, if any of my friends want to go to Chicago, I'm trusting, Mark, you'll extend
Oh,
the
they're welcome. And you know what? I'm looking out the window right now. We have about 6 inches of snow. So they
Wow.
want to come in February, they're welcome to come.
Londoners get overexcited about snow because it rarely comes to London, but when it does, it only lasts a very short while because the heat of the city just burns it off. But
We
yeah.
got plenty to go around here. I was shoveling a couple days ago and we got piles of snow.
So the reason I wanted to chat with you, Mark, was in particular about one subject that I know some of my listeners have been asking about, which is this issue of not just church planting, but restarts. And you guys seem to be the king of restarts in Chicago. There seems to be something on you that has enabled you to help churches that have hit hard times to really recover their mission. And I'm just fascinated by the way that you did that. I remember coming over that time ago and just listening to you guys share about how you went around about that process, and just blown away by the grace and the sensitivity and the honor that you kind of wrapped everything with in the process of encouraging congregations that had aged and had felt we don't quite know how to keep relevant or how to keep focused in the mission at this point in time. But you've helped those. How many churches now have you done restarts with?
So we've restarted now, I believe it's 16.
Mm-hmm.
And mainly in the city of Chicago, city proper, and then around Chicago, various denominations and groups: Baptist, Lutheran, Mennonite, EV Free, Independent, a wide spectrum, but very similar stories usually.
Wow. So what is maybe we should just define what a restart is. What do you feel is the best definition of a restart?
Yeah, so we view a restart, and we like the word restart probably as it's as good as a terminology as any. There's different people that use different language around it, but we like the word restart because we're not starting something new. We're rebooting something that was established with gospel purposes.
Hmm.
And I think it'd be helpful if I just tell you our story of our first restart. So
Yeah.
I was ministering in the city of Chicago with the mindset to church plant, just the traditional planting another church. And we were approached by a Baptist church on the other side of the city. And I'll never forget the phone call. An older gentleman, chairman of the board, called me up and he said, his name was Chuck. He said, "Mark, we've never met, and you probably have never heard of us, but I've heard of you, and I want to know if you're willing to come and help us out." And he went on to describe how this church had been just a phenomenal church in its day, one of the largest Sunday schools in the city of Chicago. They sent so many missionaries out, and At one time, they had multiple services. It was packed out. Then he lowered his voice and said, "The times have changed." And he went on to describe how they were now down to about 25 older people, like 70s and up into their 80s, the majority of them. And they were retiring and moving to Florida or dying. And Chuck said, "We don't want this building to close. We don't want it to be sold off as real estate, but we are just at the end of our rope to know what to do. So would you come and help us?" And so I said, "Chuck, I'll go meet with you. I don't know what that means, though." And I had heard Peter Wagner back in the day say, "It's easier to birth a baby than to raise the dead." And so he was talking about turning churches around. And so I thought, I'd rather plant churches than to try to take an older pre-existing church and turn it around because it feels messy. And I love Chuck's heart. It had been a traditional church, and the song leader led with the organ and sort of the hymn books, and a beautiful people, but very successful in the 1950s, but were not connecting with the neighborhood. And so that was our first restart. And he said, "Help us." And I said, "Okay." I said, "I think we do a terrible job with older people. I think we'd probably offend them. I don't think they'd like our music. So I don't want to go in there and start offending my grandmother. I don't know if it's a good fit, Chuck." He said, "I'll take care of the older people." He said, "We want to see people saved and baptized and kids in the Sunday school department again. And we want life. We don't want to shut down." And so we did it. It was a bit of an experiment. And we were bringing in young people back. This was in the 80s, with grunge, mohawks, colored hair, and piercings into sort of this traditional Baptist setting. And I thought it was about to explode. But by God's grace, it was phenomenal. A few of the older people left, but blessing us. But that place ended up being packed out and went to 2 services. So many people came to Christ, and Chuck became one of our greatest cheerleaders. And that was the very first restart that we did.
That sounds so similar to my own experience of the well in Camberwell. It was back in the 80s again, and as part of a church planting movement, we were walking around praying, and one of the guys walked into this building because the door was open, the lights were on, and there were 6 old folk praying for someone to come and lead the church, or not lead it, but to help to renew the church. And so the conversation began. He said, "I'm looking for a place to plant a church," and they were saying, "Well, we're looking for some help to start something new here." And that led to a wonderful conversation, which led to us being able to see the same thing happen, to see young people coming in, to see the worship transformed, to see a outreach renewed to the local area of Camberwell. So restarts are in our DNA as well, in that regard. So we're kind of familiar that those things can happen. But it takes a Chuck, doesn't it? It takes somebody like Chuck, it seems to me.
Yes.
So
a door opener. And what we discovered, Phil, and I just really thought it was a one-time thing. It wasn't necessarily a strategic. I thought, okay, this was a one-time opportunity that God opened up, and it was very successful, and enjoyed it. And what happened is people started hearing about it. So we started getting inquiries about, "Hey, we heard that you guys do this." And we're like, "Well, no, we did it one time. We don't necessarily do that." But as we started to explore Chicago, I quickly began to realize that there were literally hundreds of churches in the city that were struggling to survive. And I also quickly started to discover that many churches had been sold, torn down, turned into other usages, some of them high-end apartments, some of them torn down and used as strip malls, and churches that had been built for gospel proclamation. So we started to use the phrase, we're losing sacred space in the city. And once you lose those churches, it's really hard to recapture that sacred space. At one time, immigrants were moving in, church planters were moving in, sometimes 100 years ago, and they were building churches that became the hub of the community. That's where people were married and buried and baptized. The gospel was preached, and community activities were had, and people were fed. But as the church lost its relevance, oftentimes now it became the bar or some other place where people were gathering. And so we started to realize if we lose those sacred spaces, it's very hard to recapture them. And so we started with one Baptist church, and it opened up the door to many other restarts with similar stories.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting culture that we're in now, isn't it? In the sense that there's quite a lot of discussion about, well, and this whole question of sacred space is that people are saying, well, is it the gathered or is it the home? And the question of how the church functions and meets. It's still. I mean, personally, I've always been a both and person, not an either or person, and that actually. But I love that phrase. That what's it you put in one of your little articles? It's something that you lose a fort on the frontier of mission if you lose sacred space. That there is something about having a building that means that you are visible, even if the building needs some work to make it serve the community in a way that functions. But there are always potential to become that functional mission center.
Yes.
Even if the bulk of what happens outside the building, which it really should be happening outside the building, but it becomes a center and a symbol of what's going on.
Yeah, my evangelical ecclesiology is very rooted in that we, the people, are the church, not the brick and mortar. And I think that's biblical theology. However, I actually did my doctoral work on restarts, and I was impressed as I went through the Old Testament how much God seems to value spaces. And that's a little bit foreign to me. And I chalked it up a little bit more to Catholics. So evangelicals in Chicago had a different operation. When the neighborhood started to change because immigrants would come in, the evangelical church would move out of those immigrant communities and just follow their population. And so we vacated a lot of inner city space because we weren't connected to a building. It was a piece of property. We put it up for real estate and we moved. The Catholic Church was a little bit more connected to its cathedrals or churches. And so what they did, because they didn't want to let go of their quote unquote sacred space, they would switch out the priest that was there to meet the language of the immigrant coming in. And so the consequence was that oftentimes they did a better job at staying in neighborhoods that the evangelical churches had vacated.
It's a strange counterintuitive kind of sustainability, isn't it?
It really is. And so I'm not, I know that the church is people, and the early church met in the catacombs. The church is people. But I do believe that if you read the Old Testament, God has a fixation sometimes with certain spaces, the temple space, or certain places where they were sacred spaces, and God recaptured those spaces for good.
Yes.
And so I believe that we have these temples in urban areas that oftentimes are being vacated, but they were originally built for gospel purposes. And there's something powerful about planting a church in a theater or community center that doesn't have a building, but there's something very redemptive about recapturing a building that is about to close or go into disuse and recapture it for its original purposes. You
I
have the
love that.
ancient and the new together.
Yeah, I really love that, Mark. You know, that redemption, that recapturing stuff. I've seen too many buildings go up for to retail or housing in the local area, realizing actually that was a center that has a story, and that story's been lost in the midst of this consumer market that demands that every space is either retail or housing.
Yeah.
And it is, yeah. I mean, I haven't done a doctorate on it, but just as a pragmatist, as a inner city practitioner for the last 38 years, you begin to realize, hang on a minute, there's some short-term and narrow thinking here that means that if we get rid of that real estate, we're not going to see it come back very easily, that's for sure.
We did a restart, Phil, we did a restart of a building that was about 130 years old, the original place. And so R.A. Torrey had preached there. Schofield had preached there.
Wow.
And they had dedicated that corner for the gospel witness. And I didn't even know it when I went. It was a small building, but we were able to reread the prayer of dedication that was prayed over 130 years ago on that corner. And it was a powerful moment. We all gathered outside on that corner and we read what had been written 130 years ago, that this place will be a place of gospel witness. It was consecrated for the sake of the gospel. And we were so glad it wasn't lost to secular endeavors. Yeah.
Well, that is opening the wells, isn't it, again? And I know that you use that verse, 28, Genesis 26, that uncapping the wells, that was it Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug by his father, that the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham had died, and but he carries on digging new wells, but he uncaps the old ones as well. And I find that just a double win. It just seems to me, okay, if you're going to do the one, don't forget the other as well.
Yes.
There's something that is important. When we first stepped into the area where we have been rooted for the last lifetime in ministry, we basically went around praying and finding these old sites with inscriptions and places that were dedicated to God. The Maudsley Hospital, King's Hospital, all these institutes of medical institutions which are serving the community so incredibly in our day, were rooted in people who had set out with a gospel heart to serve the poor. The schools, many of the schools, the ragged schools systems were initiated through Sunday schools in our area. So there's so much of a heritage that if we dig out, not just scratch the surface, that we can start to re-dig. But so what happens with a restart? Take us a little bit through the process, Mark. What do you think is necessary for the ingredients for restarts to happen?
Yeah, so the way we've done restarts, and I'm sure there's a lot of different healthy, productive ways to do them. The way that we've done them is typically a congregation will approach us. They've heard of us doing it. Oftentimes they're on life support, really, in terms of survival, sometimes 12 people. And so they'll come and talk to us and they'll tell us the similar story. We've had great years. We're dying, really, and we don't want this building or space to go to waste. And so we typically have a meeting with them. We always go very open-handed because we don't ever want to feel like we are forcing our way in a place. We don't go with the assumption that we're the best option. We don't go with the assumption that it's God's will that we restart it. we go with a very open, explorative hand into it, and praying that they'll survive and make a difference. Normally, they're older people. Normally, they've tried different options. Like one church told us, they had tried to modernize their facility. They'd, upgraded things, and they've tried to bring in a young preacher, bring in new people. So normally they've attempted to restart this, but oftentimes because of lack of resources, energy, know-how in a very secular culture, church planting and restarting is difficult.
Yeah.
So we'll dialogue about it, and we will talk about the options, and we'll be open-handed. We'll let them know the restarts that we've done, and we'll say, this is what it means. The one church I sat down and I said, as I talked to these older individuals, I said, we try to be as upfront and honest as possible. What it means in this setting is that you probably aren't going to like the music that much. You're going to feel like you're losing traditions in your church that you've had for a long time. New people will be coming in, and you'll feel like you're outnumbered by the new people, and it will be difficult to lose control because it won't be the small family that you've known forever. And so we can guarantee it will be hard for you. It will be letting go of a culture.
There's a number of disorienting factors for folk, isn't there, who have been around for a long time, to be able to negotiate that. So how do you help them in that, Mark? What is it? I mean, obviously explaining, preparing, manage expectations is a key aspect of it. But
yeah, that's part of the most difficult part, Phil, of this. When I first went into a restart, I felt like these are small churches, but it feels like it's harder to turn than IBM or Amazon, because the decision-making process is slow. And what really helped me out is one day, as I was praying for one of these restarts, I felt like the Lord put on my heart, I needed to treat the older folks the way I would want my grandmother to be treated.
Wow. That's great.
I had a very godly grandmother. She passed away at 87, loved the Lord. She went to a little Baptist church, and that really helped me out, because I would ask myself, and I would tell our team, how would you want your grandmother to be treated? You want your grandmother to be treated with respect. You want to walk her through the process. You don't want to offend her. You want to listen. Older people are afraid of change. Because the world has changed so rapidly, and they don't understand internet technology, and values have changed, and the world is, so sometimes the only piece of certainty that they have is what they've held on to for a long time. And so we don't want to strip that away. We want to enhance that, encourage that. And so what we say is, we can guarantee it'll be difficult, but we also can guarantee that our history is that you're going to see new families coming. You're going to see children in the nursery. You're going to see young people getting baptized. You're going to hear the gospel being preached. You're going to see people in the pews that these pews have been empty for a long time. We did one restart of an evangelical church, and the main guy that had been there for a long time, he was in his 80s. His name was Bud. And we had our grand opening. The place was packed out with families and people that came. And he literally cried through the whole service and told the pastor afterwards, now I can die. My prayers have been answered.
Wow.
See, he had been for years seeing a steady decline, for years praying that the church would turn around, and just wasn't able to see that. And so he was visibly moved and felt like, okay, now my job is done.
My eyes have seen the glory of the Lord.
Yes. Yeah.
They're wonderful.
But it's difficult because you have to manage expectations. So we go into typically a dating period. We want them to know this is what it's going to look like. Go visit some of our other locations, talk to some people. We don't shut the church down legally. We don't do that because we don't feel like it's in line with our heart. Our heart is to restart it. When we first started going down this road, people would tell us it's better just to shut the church down and to dissolve it and then restart it because there's liabilities and so forth. But we said, well, that's not our heart. Our heart is not to shut a church down. Our heart is to restart a church, and it'll restart with a new name, and it'll restart with leaders. But we're going to merge both of the congregations together. We're going to honor the past, celebrate what's been done there, not erase it, not put it down, not act like, hey, you failed and we're here like spiritual colonialism to restart this church. And the colonialists, and I grew up in Spain, but when they came to America, basically they acted like the natives never existed and that they had just discovered America and put the flag there, obliterating the existing culture. That's colonialism.
Yeah.
But we don't want to be colonialists. We want to celebrate what's there and merge it into what we're doing.
That struck me when I came to your Restart conference, the degree of honor that you lavished on the older congregation and the stories. You told their stories. And I just was so thrilled just to see that, because what it looked like was this is a genuine family fire that is being stoked here again. And it isn't the case of the old people that are irrelevant in the process. They are an absolute essential part of stoking this whole fire. And that was, again, our experience. I think all six of the old folk in College Green Baptist Church, as it was called back then, they stayed until they either died or they moved into retirement context out of London. And some of them would sit there like this at the back of the service, but they all suffered and enjoyed at the same time. So it was like this mixed sense of, okay, this isn't quite how we would do it necessarily, but we appreciate that this is what God is doing now. And everybody, all the young people treated like grandparents. They were the honorary grandparents of the congregations. So yes, exactly that story. So
I had one, Phil. Well, Chuck actually of the first Restart. He told me a couple months after it started. I said, Chuck, how are you adjusting to all this? He said, I've never been more busy in my life. I have all these young couples coming to me. And he said, I feel like a grandparent speaking into them. He said, I don't like the music. He said, so I listen to my music, my hymns. I listen on the way there to worship service. And I tolerate your worship. But he said, I think it's worth it. He said, I don't like the worship of the young people. Yeah. And we learned over the years, we try to mix it in now a little bit more. We'll try to throw in some more historic worship into our restarts now than we did at the beginning. But it's still going to be a jolt for people, especially those that have more contemporary worship. But it's, I think we need to embrace a culture of honor, and the leaders have to understand, and most of them know also, and I would say this, most of the older people understand that their grandchildren are not being reached by their type of service as well. And so just as much as I like to treat them as I would want my grandparents to be treated, I also tell them, if you were trying to reach your grandson or your granddaughter, how would you would tolerate a lot to reach them, wouldn't you? And they say, yeah, well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach your grandsons and granddaughters' generation.
You've done a good job of discipleship there, Mark, to both generations, I think, in this process of working into what it looks like. It is a discipling process, isn't it, for us who get older, to stay flexible, and for us for those of us who are younger to be able to honor the age. I think the generational challenge, I think in this age of polarity and people going to binary positions on just about everything, it is. A friend of mine uses the acronym RAGE. The race, age, gender, and economics are a very helpful way for us to understand that the enemy's got no new tricks. He uses all of those four, but it is all of those that we are constantly being in need of discipleship, in need of learning, in need of mentoring, in need of helping from those around us, from peers. But I think restarts present us with a real good opportunity for that sort of process, where you're mixing it up and you're saying, okay, here's an older generation, here's a younger generation. What's the discipleship win in this context for both generations? Let me just ask, I wonder if, because you're really good at sharing the dream, Mark, and I think that's quite a key element, isn't it? Visionary leadership is part of the DNA, really, that helps set the fire going again. So is it just that you bring that through the everyday preaching or whatever, or teaching or discipleship or community that you invest leaders into? Or is there a specific kind of brief within restarts to teach something or focus on some aspects? Or is it very open to folk?
Yeah, I think that, well, when you're going into a restart, I think that people have to know why they're sacrificing and what they have to know, is it worth giving up my comfort for? So I would say on the existing congregation, we cast vision of the future, and they already know, they see the signs already written on the wall, that if they continue the way they're going, eventually the church will close and there will be no gospel witness there. So we normally don't have to tell them that. They kind of see it coming. Everybody wants a different outcome, but most people don't want to change the way they're doing things. So if you talk to most churches that need to be restarted, they would say, yeah, we want to reach the community. They're just not coming in. We want to reach young families. They just don't stay. We're a friendly church. We love when people visit. So they want to see the church full again. They want to see people coming to Christ. But then when you start talking about, will you change the service hour? Will you, change the style of music? Are you willing to do this? Then people, they're not sure they want to give up what they've done for a long time. So part of my job as a leader is to try to let them understand why it's worth doing. And so is it worth having this church survive? And is it worth reaching this community? Oftentimes in Chicago, say the congregation is older white, but the neighborhood is Puerto Rican and Black now, or it has changed ethnically. So sometimes there's an ethnic issue there, or sometimes it's a generational. The first restart that we did, the average age in the congregation was 75. The average age in the community was 26. And so there was a very big generational gap. So you have to cast a vision to the existing congregation, but you also have to cast a vision to the young bucks going in that don't understand why we have to do it slowly and cautiously and graciously. They just want to tear down walls and throw out organs and, put screens over everything. And so they don't understand why we have to go slow. And so to them, I have to cast a vision of a multi-generational church that honors the history, but embraces the present. And they have to understand the value of that. Most church plants, at least in the US, if they're driven by a 30-year-old young couple, they all are young families, or they're all young. And so you have very little multi-generational um, samples in the congregation. This is an opportunity to build a multi-generation. So you have the saints of old with the young. And I think there's a beauty in that. There's a power in that, in a multi-generational congregation. So you're dealing with the existing congregation, you're dealing with the new core that you're bringing, and you're also dealing with the neighbors on the outside. So I look at it as three different groups: the existing congregation, the new group that you're bringing in, and the community that you're trying to reach. And so you have to think in those terms.
I mean, it takes a strategic thinker, doesn't it, to be able to look at all those moving parts and tell a story from all those different parts. And is there, already, obviously you created a culture within your church network of that allows for creative, strategic thinkers to rise up there. So there's a leadership pipeline that you developed in some way. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to do within Reach in London is to help churches to recognize where they can partner and where they can develop, but also to develop that culture in which strategic thinkers and strategic leaders can prosper and find space so that they can be able to help people to think from all these different angles. I don't know if you want to say anything into that at this point.
Absolutely. Here's what I would say. We're doing restarts right now. I'm in the middle of one right now that's on the north side of Chicago, and it's a nice building. It was primarily a Spanish speaking congregation. The neighborhood is gentrified, and we're working through it right now. The pastor that we're bringing in, he's never done a restart. So what we do is we have a restart coach. We have a couple of on our team that have done it multiple times. And so we kind of coach them through the process. We're at the meetings, we set it up for a win. So I would say that if you're a church that's looking to do a restart and has a restart opportunity, I would definitely try to get someone that's been through this before. And I would say if you're in London area, I didn't talk to Phil about this. I don't know if they're set up to do this, but I would try to get someone like Phil or someone like Phil that's done this before on a coaching team. I would say, hey, can you walk us through this? It's definitely you could blow it. And I've seen a lot of restarts blown. I've seen it approached the wrong way. I've seen young, aggressive churches view restarts as a real estate grab and really dishonor the existing congregations. I've seen what could be a win-win scenario turn ugly and turn into just a volatile situation. So I do think that if you have access to coaching, someone that's done it before, someone that's experienced, I would definitely tap in to that kind of knowledge, because these restarts are difficult to broker. So I don't know, I may be putting you on the spot, Phil, but if I were in London and we're doing a restart, I would call up Phil and say, hey, Phil, could you walk us through this since you've done this before?
As we're looking to see through the vision of Reach is to help people with this process in whatever context, really. So we're not a church in that regard, but we are simply a network of churches who are saying we want to take our resources out and to help other churches in their process. And if there's young people within that context that need some coaching in the process, we're here for them as well. I'm really impressed that people, I mean, obviously you've gained a reputation. The first one happened, Chuck rings you up, and there seems to have been a snowball of grace upon New Life to see people approaching you. So if we're not in that position where we've got lots of people knocking on our door to say, can we restart? Where would you suggest we even begin with this discussion, Mark?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get that question asked a lot of times, and people are sensitive about being approached sometimes. But I think if somehow you can let people know that there is an option besides closing your doors. And so what we do is people that know that we've done restart successfully, and they know of a church that's about to close or struggle, they'll sometimes give a number or card and say, you know what, our church has done restarts before. Have you ever considered a restart? And oftentimes they don't even know what a restart is or aren't exposed to that. And so I would get the word out, very open-handed, and let people know there's an option besides closing their door, and conversations. But if you approach churches, I would be very sensitive about how you approach the church, because people are very protective. And
understandably.
I would go in very open-handed and let them know, if you're ever interested in talking about this, I think there's other options. And if you want to dialogue about this, we have done this before, or some churches. We have a restart video that we did a long time ago. And I know one pastor that downloaded it on his iPhone, and he would show people and say, see how they're doing in Chicago? We believe it can be done here as well. And so I think people can point to healthy restarts. Even if you've never done a restart, you can point to healthy restarts that have been done and saying, this is what we'd like to do here.
Brilliant. I think it's a brilliant place to close, Mark. The question of how do we start it? Well, just being aware of it. It's just as an option is a key, isn't it? And if we're able, just through this video and through other means, and through that the video that you produced all that while back, I use still occasionally to send to people. And you can get, if you want to find out, folks, go to newliferestarts.org, is it?
Yes.
Which gives Mark's information about their story here, and a wonderful little electronic teaching booklet that you can get, which is called God Was Already Here. And
it's free. The video's free. Feel free to use the booklet. Feel free to use the video. Again, it's an American context, so some of it is, besides the weird accent, some of it's unique to Chicago. London has its own dynamics, I'm sure, or wherever you're at currently. But I think some of the principles are transferable to wherever you're at in the world.
They're transferable. I think just the testimony generates faith. And to hear the stories, I think is a wonderful thing. Mark, thank you so much for spending time and just giving us a little bit of an insight, telling us your story. We're going to be pulling on this thread a little bit more over the coming years. I believe that restarts are going to be a feature of what God does in London in the coming season. We are looking to see new churches planted. We're looking to see restarts happen. And we know that there is something new that God has got ready for us in post-pandemic, but even in the midst of this pandemic, there is some incredible creative thinking going on.
Yes.
We're seeing people preparing. It feels to me like prophets being prepared in the wilderness in some ways, but there's a lot of preparing going on, and a lot of thinking, and a lot of rethinking and understanding what it looks like to be a church or in a community on mission, a family on mission in a community. So we're very grateful to you. Get Mark's booklet, download it from the website. And if you want to find out more about Reach, you can follow the link at the bottom here, and we'll look forward to connecting with you. Do ask any questions or make any comments, and we'll try and get back to you. Mark, thank you very much. God bless you, sir.
Thank you, Phil. God bless you, brother.